My name is Toni Fishman. I am the CEO and founder of Telefunken Electroacoustic, Telefunken Soundstage, and Telefunken Electro Records. So I kind of struggled in school, and my release was, to go out and try to see some music. Should have graduated high school in 1987. By that time, I was fully immersed with Max Creek.
Tell me what's up. Tell me what is the short now. Do you set it on up or just leave it? Burning debris and smoke. I'm taking my eyes like they used to use. Taking my lips to the thoughts I smoke. And one of us lies. The other listens. Who walking to see my head? It's time. By my rules and I'm turning up glory. By the next guy's I've been staying. One of us knows where to stay in the background. Who walking to see it in my head? The protection. Spinning in
I was really attracted to Max Creek kind of out the gate, and it opened doors for other bands like the Grateful Dead and Fish, a Bay Area band called Zero. So that's sort of where I hung my hat, was going to those shows, and I started taping with some AKG 414 microphones and a Sony D5 cassette recorder. And I soon went on a quest to discover what microphones sounded best, what brands, what styles. And for many years, I was just collecting microphones. Out of high school, worked at a stereo shop in Hartford, Connecticut on Farmington Avenue. The stereo shop was called The Stereo Shop. I also had a second job at the time, which was working at a camera shop, which was called The Camera Shop. So I worked at the camera shop and I worked at the stereo shop. And I found that I really loved anything to do with, auditory senses. Anything that I was listening to or looking at. I love being behind the camera. My first somewhat professional involvement within music was I had a job working for a local paper, very similar to the Hartford Advocate. Before it was called the Advocate, it was called The Scene. And I had a press pass, and I was able to do a lot of concert photography. That sort of brought me into the backstage areas and meeting the bands and meeting front of house engineers and monitor engineers. And what I come to realize was that there were far more shutterbugs in the world and professional photographers than there were people who actually knew about microphones. You could find people everywhere who could tell me anything about certain cameras, but finding information about certain microphones required a lot of research and contacting the manufacturers and talking with their sales reps and learning about the products. So I did, I think, like a 5-year stint between stereo shop and camera shop, and I was working, towards the end of that, I was working for my family within commercial real estate, and I knew that wasn't a path I really wanted to follow. I ended up settling down in Simsbury, Connecticut, which is very close to the epicenter of where Max Creek's kind of home base was. 97, 98, 99 is when I started turning my house in Simsbury into Talcott Mountain Studio. I had created a small 3-bedroom house with a Neve console. Didn't have a Neve in it right away. My first console was like a Tascam. I had like a sunroom that first became the studio. And then I had filled up the sunroom, and I decided, well, maybe I should flip it around. Maybe I should use the sunroom as the relaxing space and take the living room and turn that into a control room. And I did that for a little while, and then through another friendship of mine, the Neve console kind of popped on my radar and decided to kind of go for it. The idea was to have a mix down studio with an ISO, use that sunroom as an ISO, and I had a really dear friend of mine. His name was Brian Hasselman. His nickname was Moose, and Moose knew me as a taper, not as a professional engineer. And Moose was like, "You got to stop taping all these bands for free, Tony. You have to get out there and start multi-tracking." We ended up taking an airport shuttle truck and converting it into a mobile recording truck that we basically built because it was very friendly with Ken Hayes, the force behind Gathering the Vibes, for about 15 years. So I went out on the road with my friend Moose, and we started recording with the truck. I had known Moose for years before we built the truck. And the reason why we built the truck was he'd been working for Warren Haynes, Government Mule, and I guess he was coming back from a show from New York City. About 4 a.m. he fell asleep behind the wheel and was paralyzed in the accident. And from the waist down, he became paraplegic, and we built the truck out of necessity. I sort of knew everything about microphones, and he knew everything about tracking and turning knobs. And this airport shuttle truck had a lift on the side, so we were able to get him, in and out. And I'd go inside the club and set up the mics, and he would twist knobs in the bus all night, or the truck all night. I was up in Vermont and came back one Christmas holiday. I came back early to miss the lines in Vermont and found some broken pipes in the studio and a rather large flood. What took 5 years to build was kind of washed away in 5 days. And I'll tell you, that right there is the beginning of the creation of the new Telefunken. I was always hunting for vintage microphones. You go buy anything new, finding good vintage microphones was really a difficult thing. So at one point, a different friend of mine had told me that Warner Brothers was going out of business in Nashville and that they would be auctioning about 300 vintage tube microphones. My low bid won. I got a phone call from a guy named Robert Tassi and Eric Prestige at Warner Brothers Reprise Records in Nashville, and they said, "You got to get a big truck and you got to come down here, because you got to get all these microphones out of here before the end of the week." I flew down to Nashville and I drove back in a 30-foot Penske truck filled to the ceiling with microphones. When I got back to my studio in Simsbury, they were all in Nashville road cases, and that makes each microphone system quite large, and I just didn't have enough room for all of it. And we soon found out that not all the microphones were working. In the collection, there were 4 Elam 251 microphones. 2 of them were 6072 variants, the export version, and 2 of them were AC 701. I'd actually bought the whole collection because I wanted the 4 Elams. But there were 4 U47s, and 4 U48s, and 4 C12s, and 4 M50s, and 4 249s, and 4 49s, and 4 U67s. It was basically 4 of everything that Neumann AKG ever made. There was nobody in the area who knew how to fix a microphone for 500 miles or more. I'd have to send them down to Nashville, or I'd have to send them to LA. That was the moment it kind of clicked, and that I realized that that my abilities kind of led me to take it apart, see what made it tick, find or make the parts that no longer were available to repair the microphones. Through a series of deals, introduced me to John McBride down in Nashville at Blackbird. And John has, he's sort of the founding father of Telefunken, if you will. In that it became very clear that he wanted to buy all of the microphones. So over a period of the next 2 or 3 years, I sold microphones in batches to Blackbird and began bringing in the equity I needed. I ended up selling those $100,000 worth of microphones for about $750,000 when it was all said and done. Some of them I still own, and that was the seed money to begin here in South Windsor. I started with about 5 employees, a secretary and a friend of mine who really helped me found the company. His expertise was in logistics and headhunting. And I'd say, well, I need to make this part. Find me a CNC machine shop that I can drive to within a 50-mile radius. So we went through the 251 part by part, drew everything that we needed drawings for. We had some original blueprints and circuit design, and we broke it into parts that were plastic, parts that were metal, parts that were electrolytic. We started in the plastic injection molding. We started making the pattern switch for the 251. A couple of mine had broken pattern switches, and it was literally from that switch being an Achilles heel. You know, it would dry out, the plastic would dry out and vulcanize with age from the heat of the tube inside of the microphone. So the microphones get older, the plastics get more brittle. So there were an awful lot of 251s out there floating around with disintegrating switch housings and switches and plastics. We made the plastics available again at an AES, I think in New York City, the Javits Center, and I couldn't believe the response. Walked around with a fishing tackle box with plastic parts in it. Went from microphone booth to microphone booth to meet and greet whoever I could who had a studio, who was in the 251 club. And we went and sold some parts in the beginning to some friends of mine in repair, and those guys were like, well, the parts are spot on. Are you going to do the rest of the parts? And, well, if you're going to do this, why don't you do this as Telefunken? I had no idea how that was going to come to fruition. A friend of mine came forward and he was like, well, you know, they went out of business and they abandoned their trademark, and in order to have a trademark and keep and maintain a trademark, you have to vigorously enforce that trademark. We had successfully recreated some of the parts already, and my friend Oliver said, are you sure you want to jump down this rabbit hole? I basically told him it was my destiny. I believe that the brand found me, that I didn't have to go looking for the brand. These things are happening in the universe for a reason. It's a miracle that we were able to pull it off. So first, Oliver registered the trademark in Seattle, Washington, the diamond shape with the lightning bolts without the words Telefunken in it. So we registered the diamond-shaped logo with USPTO. After doing this research, we decided to put the word Telefunken back in the box to name the company Telefunken North America. And we came to market in early 2002 with the first pair of 251s we were able to sell for $20,000.